Today we're taking a look at the least expensive Mercedes on sale in the United States. It's the 2017 Mercedes Metris. This is known as the Mercedes Vito in other world markets. In America, Mercedes-Benz is best known for selling full-on luxury vehicles. However, in Europe, they also sell a complete line of commercial vehicles. In some areas of the world, you're just as likely to see a Mercedes-Benz luxury car on the road as a Mercedes-Benz with a tradesman's logo on the side. And that's exactly what the Metris is in America. We do not get the Mercedes-Benz V-Class in the US at this time. The V-Class is basically the luxury version of this minivan. So where does the Metris fit in? Well, this is almost exactly the same size as a classic American minivan. That means this is notably larger than something like a Transit Connect, Nissan NV200, or the Ram ProMaster City. But it's also considerably smaller than the Mercedes Sprinter van, which is their full-size passenger and cargo van. For the American market, this model comes in a variety of different passenger and cargo configurations. We're driving one of the lower-end passenger configurations, so we have this body-colored bumper right up front. You'll notice this is a little bit different than the Mercedes-Benz V-Class that we find in Europe, because that's a full-on luxury-oriented model, so we don't find the LED headlamps or other treatments up front that we find in that model. At 202.4 inches long, the Metris slots right between the Chrysler Pacifica and the Kia Sedona in terms of overall length. That means this is a very important 16 inches longer than the Nissan NV200. It's also notably longer than either version of the Transit Connect, whether we're talking about the short model or the long model, or the Ram ProMaster City. That's because this is not the smallest Mercedes passenger or cargo van. In Europe and in other world markets, there's actually a smaller van out there, so this slots right between the Sprinter and those small van options. A space that really doesn't have any entry in the United States because Chrysler has actually canceled the Caravan CV, replacing it with the ProMaster City, which means the Mercedes Metris is now the only option in the United States if you want a mid-size van. As you'd expect from a cargo or passenger van, we have that very square profile out back, but for the American market, this front profile looks a little unusual. And that's because the Mercedes Metris is a rear-wheel drive van. That means if you've been holding out to find a replacement for your Astro or Aerostar minivan, the Metris would be the one for you. The more rugged mission of the Metris is obvious out back, where we have much more rugged and durable hinges that are on the outside of the doors, not concealed on the inside. And of course we have the doors themselves, which are these double barn doors that open 180 degrees with the vehicle. They don't fold back to the sides like we find in some of the larger cargo vans. The reason we have the double barn doors in the Metris is because of the cargo carrying mission of the vehicle. If you were to lift something into the vehicle with a forklift, you don't want a lift back coming up because you'll hit that with your forklift, so you want doors that open to the side. Instead of a V6 like your average American minivan, under this hood you'll find a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine that you also find under a variety of other Mercedes products. Because the Metris is a rear-wheel drive passenger van, the majority of that engine is right here under this plastic area and under the windshield. Power comes in at 208 horsepower, which may sound a little bit low for the average American minivan, but torque is right up there with the rest of the pack at 258. An advantage for this vehicle is that power is routed through a 7-speed automatic transmission, not a 6-speed like we find in some of the minivans in America. Although all-wheel drive is not available in the Metris at the moment, I suspect it will be in the future, because Mercedes tells us that there is nothing substantively different about this vehicle than the European Vito, so there's no reason they couldn't fit that all-wheel drive system right here under the hood. According to Mercedes, this model should average 22 miles per gallon on the 2017 EPA cycle. We've actually been getting a little bit better than that, as we'll talk about in the drive section. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give this 7 out of 10 points when compared to American minivans. We don't have the same range of motion in this seat as we find in most American vans. No power seat in the model we're driving, no adjustable lumbar support in this model either. We also don't have a steering column that telescopes, it just tilts. You will find different seats in different trims of the Metris, but as I said earlier, the Metris is not the Mercedes-Benz V-Class that we find in Europe. So the V-Class in Europe has a much different dashboard layout, much more comfortable seats, etc. If you had a minivan in the 80s, the seating arrangement in the Metris may seem familiar to you because these are separate modules. We have a 2-person bench seat in the middle, a 3-person bench seat in the back, but you can put the 3-person bench seat from the back into the middle. That's something that you can't do in modern American minivans because the 3rd-row seats are all fixed into place because they go back down into the trunk. Now, moving these seat modules is a little bit more of a pain than simply folding a seat into the floor of a vehicle, but it is a little bit more configurable. On the downside, the 2nd row and the 3rd row seats do not fold and they do not recline. That means we cannot fold them forward to put longer cargo in the vehicle, and we cannot recline them for added comfort. In addition to shoulder belts integrated into the seat backs themselves, this 2-person bench module also includes 2 sets of latch anchors if you'd like to install your child seats that way. As you'd expect from a vehicle with a very upright profile, headroom is very generous in the Metris. If I sit upright in the second row seat, I have about 2 inches left, and that's exactly the same whether we're talking about the second row or the third row. Even though the third row bench does not recline, overall seat comfort is good. You'll definitely find more room back here than in your average 3-row crossover because the minivan is wider than your average 3-row crossover. Quite logically, the shoulder belt is attached to the seat itself, not to the vehicle. That makes it more comfortable for adults and easier to install child seats in the seat. The 3-person bench seat offers 2 sets of latch anchors if you want to attach a child seat in that manner. You can also put this 3-person bench in the second row position. There are a few different floor options, and obviously the floor changes whether we get the passenger version or the cargo version, but because we're in the passenger version, we have these aluminum rails with the fixing points for the seat modules. If you put the rear seat module in this second row seat position, then you would be using these outboard latch positions. In case you're wondering, it is also possible to install the 2-person bench module right back here in the third row. As you'd expect from a vehicle that was designed to carry passengers and cargo, we have a great deal of storage space behind the third row. You'll find 38 cubic feet behind the third row. That's enough for 8 of these 24-inch roller bags. Now, I can't open the other door because they'll all roll out. That's a surprising amount of space, considering that the Metris is a rear-wheel drive minivan, and that is generally a little bit less space efficient than a front-wheel drive layout. You'll notice that we don't have that deep cargo well that we find in some of the other minivans in America. The load floor is actually very flat right there all the way through the vehicle. If you were to buy the cargo version of the Metris, you'd get 186 cubic feet of space inside the van. If you were to take all the seats out of the passenger version, there would be just a little bit less because of the interior trim panels in the rear, but it would still beat the ProMaster, the NV200, or the Transit Connect by a decent margin. The largest of those would be the long wheelbase Transit Connect at only 128 cubic feet. It would also still beat the Chrysler Pacifica at 140 feet total. If you're looking at the Metris because you want to carry a mixture of passengers and cargo, there are a few things you should know. The first thing is that the seats do not fold forward. They stay right here in position like this. They don't recline, they don't fold in any way. So if you want to shove more cargo in the vehicle, you will have to remove the seat module. Unlike some of the American minivans that split the seat module in pieces, this 3-person bench seat is one complete piece. So you do have to remove it from the vehicle just like that. The second thing you should know is that the width of the cargo area is not the same between the passenger version and the cargo version. The building staple of America, a 4x8 sheet of plywood, will fit in the cargo version, but it will not fit in the passenger version. The reason for that is right back here on the driver's side of the vehicle. This is where we find some of the components of the rear climate control system, and that does take up about 2 inches of width, meaning you can no longer fit a 4x8 sheet of something in the passenger version of the Metris. Obviously, cargo capacity is a big reason to buy the Metris over the Transit Connect, the NV200, or the ProMaster City. But payload capacity is another big reason you might want to choose the Metris over those smaller vehicles, because this has a payload capacity of 2,500 pounds and a towing ability of 5,000 pounds when properly equipped. 2,500 pounds of payload capacity is 1,000 pounds higher than we find in the Transit Connect or the NV200, 700 pounds higher than we find in the ProMaster City, and also notably higher than we find in the passenger versions of the Pacifica, the Odyssey, or the Sedona. As we take a look around the interior, it's important to keep in mind that the Metris's mission is a little bit more utilitarian than the Sedona or the Odyssey. Up front, we have height adjustable seat belts for the driver and the front passenger, 2-way adjustable headrests, and the model we're driving has fabric seats. The industrial mission is the reason that the front doors and the dashboard are composed entirely of hard touch plastics. Hard plastics are easier to clean and they're more durable long-term than soft plastics, and that's why we find them in a vehicle like this. It's worth noting that one of the downsides to having the rear-wheel drive layout in the Metris is that the B-pillar in the vehicle seems to be a little bit further forward, making the front doors a little bit smaller than the average American minivan. That may make it a little bit more difficult for larger people to get in and out of the front seats, but that's really the only impact we see in terms of the interior design. In the front doors, we have large and deep pockets down there lower with integrated bottle holders. Moving over to the dashboard, we find round air vents on the passenger side and the driver's side. There's a knob to open and close them. We find these interestingly located large cup holders and some storage cubbies in the dashboard where you can easily put manuals, that sort of thing. There's one right there on the passenger side, one in the middle, and then another one on the driver's side. Below the passenger airbag, we have a bin-style glove compartment. I wasn't able to fit a large tablet computer inside, but smaller ones will fit. In the center of the dashboard, we have 2 more air vents. The knob closes the air vent and also directs air up and down. If you want to move air side to side, that's this rotating dial down below. In the center of the dashboard, we have 2 more air vents. The knob in the middle opens and closes the vent and directs air up and down. If you want to move air side to side, we use this dial right here. In the center of everything, we have the infotainment and optional navigation system. This is one of Mercedes' older systems that we don't find in too many active Mercedes models in the United States. You'll notice that our particular model does not have navigation built in, but we do have a USB and iPod interface. Below the infotainment screen, we find storage cubbies on either side, USB input and auxiliary input over here on the driver's side, buttons to open and close the power sliding doors, a drive mode selector that allows us to shift between economy, comfort, and manual. We have a traction control disable button, and then the button to open and close the door on the other side of the vehicle. Between the storage cubbies, we have a partial automatic climate control system. The damper adjustment is automatic based on the temperature selection over here on the left. You then adjust the fan speed manually and which vent you want the air to come out of manually as well. Below that, we have two large cup holders that easily accommodate large takeout drinks, and you'll notice that we don't have any center console between the front seats. The instrument cluster is a relatively basic design with a speedometer on the left, a tachometer on the right, and then a multifunction display in the middle. The multifunction display is controlled via these two buttons right over here by the speedometer. We can cycle between our trip computer screens, and then you can also hit this R button to reset. The steering wheel is a familiar 3-spoke design, only instead of being leather wrapped, this is just a urethane steering wheel. We still have sport grips up top, and unusually we still have paddle shifters as well, down on the left and up on the right. You'll notice this steering wheel does not have audio controls on the face, and we don't have a cruise control stock because the model that we're driving does not have the cruise control option. When it comes to acceleration, the Metris is a little bit slower to 60 than most of the other minivans we find in America. We ran from 0 to 60 in 8.5 seconds in this model. This is the passenger model, and that was when we had no other passengers in the vehicle, just the driver, as with our usual 0 to 60 tests. That's about a second slower than the average American minivan, but this actually feels a little bit peppier than that number would otherwise indicate, thanks to the turbocharged engine and the 7-speed automatic. This transmission is much faster shifting than any of the other minivans that are on sale in America. This is essentially the same 7-speed automatic that we find under the hood of certain generations of Mercedes C-Class and E-Class transmissions, so this transmission has an excellent pedigree. When hill climbing, you'll definitely notice a big difference between the Metris and every other minivan in America, because this turbocharged engine has more low-end torque than the average V6 in this category, and that means this vehicle does not have to downshift like the rest of the competition in order to climb hills. It makes it feel a little bit more relaxed. In our braking tests, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 139 feet. That is on the long side for the minivan category. Even the Chrysler Pacifica hybrid minivan, which weighs nearly 5,000 pounds, stopped a little bit shorter than this vehicle. Because of the more commercial-focused mission of the Metris versus something like an Odyssey or a Pacifica, we have much more commercial-focused tires on this particular vehicle. They're higher profile, they're also not as wide as top-end versions of the Sienna, the Odyssey, or the Pacifica. The tires, as well as the overall taller profile of the Metris, definitely take a toll on the handling. I'm going to give this a C+ when compared to the average American minivan. Of course, if you were to compare this to the average American full-size cargo van, this is definitely much more nimble, so it really depends on what you want to compare the Metris to. Although the Metris is the same size as the average American minivan, and there is a passenger version like the one that we're driving right here, the primary mission of this vehicle is as an alternative to a large cargo van. When you view the Metris in that light, it does come out a little bit differently because this is much more nimble and stops shorter and accelerates faster than most of those full-size vans in America. The high payload capacity of the Metris means that this vehicle has to have firmer springs in order to support that payload, and that does reduce the ride quality. That's not too surprising, of course, because the mission of this van is different than the mission of the Toyota Sienna or the Honda Odyssey or the Chrysler Pacifica, which are going to be much softer out on the road. If you're looking for a soft highway cruiser for your family, this may not be the best choice. You may find a more comfortable long-term ride in the Odyssey or the Chrysler or the Toyota. When it comes to cabin noise, we scored a surprising 72 decibels at 50 miles an hour. That makes us just about as quiet as the average American passenger minivan, definitely quieter than a full-size cargo van in America. The other thing that's definitely better than the average full-size cargo van in America is the fuel economy score. Over a week and about 300 miles of mixed driving, we have averaged 24 miles per gallon, which is 2 miles per gallon better than Mercedes says you should get. That's over a variety of different driving situations and, of course, with some cargo in the back. That shouldn't surprise you too much because this Mercedes 2-liter 4-cylinder engine has proved very efficient in every Mercedes model that I've tested it in. As I said at the beginning of the video, the Metris is now the least expensive Mercedes sold in America, starting at $25,995. Of course, that low sticker price does buy you the cargo van. If you want the passenger van version of the Metris, then that's more expensive. That's $29,995. As we see with many Mercedes models out there, adding options can get fairly expensive. And if you add all of the available options to the Metris in the US, you'll end up at $45,600. Comparisons are a little bit difficult with the Metris because overall it is about the same size as the Odyssey, the Sienna, the Sedona, and the Pacifica, but it really has a more commercial mission in mind. Therefore, the more appropriate competition for most Metris versions would be the Transit Connect, the Nissan NV200, the Ram ProMaster City, and of course something like the full-size Ram ProMaster, the Chevy Express, or the Ford Transit. You might be thinking to yourself at this point, but the Metris comes as a passenger vehicle. If it really was more commercial intended, why is there this passenger version? The most likely reason the passenger version of the Metris exists is the chicken tax, and now it's time for a little bit of a history lesson. In 1963, in response to French and German tariffs on importing U.S. chicken, the United States responded with a wide variety of import taxes on all sorts of things from Europe and around the world. Large portions of the chicken tax have since been repealed, but the one thing that hasn't is a 25% tariff on the import of light trucks. The chicken tax is the key reason that in the United States you don't find the same variety of utilitarian vehicles or small pickup trucks that we find around the world. It's simply too expensive to bring them to the US if they're made outside of North America. The chicken tax is also the reason that we've had a few unusual vehicles in the United States over the years, like the Subaru Brat, because by adding 2 seats to the bed of the pickup truck, it was no longer a pickup truck, it was now a passenger vehicle. And it's also the reason that for a while you were able to find chassis cab versions of Toyota's small pickup trucks. However, loopholes have been closed over the years, and at this point, it's the reason that Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and other manufacturers make their pickup trucks in the United States. You might be wondering what this has to do with Mercedes and the Metris. Well, at the moment, the Metris and the Sprinter are assembled in Europe, and then they're actually partially disassembled, brought back to the United States, and then reassembled. The disassembly and reassembly process is how manufacturers get around the chicken tax at this moment. Of course, other manufacturers have gotten around the chicken tax by shipping the vehicle as a passenger vehicle and then removing the seats and recycling them when they get here, but Mercedes takes a slightly different approach. The most likely reason the passenger version exists in the US is because they're all being made on the same line and it already had to meet US crash standards, so all they have to do is send a passenger vehicle down the same line, put it on the cargo carrier, and that vehicle does not have to be disassembled and reassembled because it has seats in it. Now, it's worth noting that over the next year or two, Mercedes is changing this process because they will actually be building the Sprinter and the Metris in the United States. That will not only avoid the chicken tax, but it should also allow them to produce much larger numbers of their passenger and cargo vans, which is something they're really interested in because Mercedes wants a bigger pie in the commercial market in this country. Yes, you heard that right, the commercial market, not necessarily the passenger carrying market. If they were interested in doing that, they would bring the Mercedes-Benz V-Class from Europe to America. This is what a V-Class looks like on the outside, and this is what the V-Class looks like on the inside. You can think of the Mercedes V-Class as the C-Class minivan. The interior of the V-Class is far more luxurious, it's styled differently, it's styled very much like the current generation Mercedes C-Class, E-Class, and S-Class. Everything about the V-Class is more luxurious. The seats are more adjustable, they're more comfortable, there are more luxury features, gadgets, options, and gizmos available. But this is the minivan we don't get in the United States. Instead, we get the Mercedes Metris. So let's talk about competition. The first and most direct competitor is the Ford Transit Connect. The Transit Connect starts at $23,000 for the short wheelbase model, which is considerably smaller than the Metris. For the long wheelbase version, you'll pay $24,010. That's not too far off the starting price of a base Metris model. However, the Metris does offer fewer features than we find in the standard Transit Connect. Still, it's not too big of a stretch to jump up from a base Transit Connect model into a base Metris model, but you do need to be careful with that options list because it is possible to make the Metris quite expensive. The extra cash buys you a vehicle that is significantly more capable. You'll find almost 900 pounds more payload in the Metris, 3,000 pounds more towing ability, 81 cubic feet more cargo capacity, which is nearly double what we find in the Transit Connect, and that very important ability to carry 4x8 sheets of something in the back. The ability to carry 4x8 sheets of plywood or 4x8 sheets of anything is really what separates a minivan in the mainstream segment in America from the very compact vans that we also find now, like the Transit Connect. Depending on the version of the Transit Connect you're looking at, you may have a slightly higher EPA rating, but in real-world driving, the Metris will be on par or actually slightly more efficient. And thanks to the 7-speed automatic transmission and the turbocharged engine, the Metris is going to feel peppier out on the road. If you're watching this video from Europe, you're probably wondering, why am I comparing a Transit Connect to a Metris? They're not really the same vehicle. The answer is that in the United States, they compete with one another, but elsewhere in the world they really don't, because Mercedes has a smaller van that more directly competes with the Transit Connect in Europe, but in America, we don't get that small Mercedes van. We only get the Ford Transit Connect, and we only get the Metris. The lack of that compact Mercedes van in America is why you can also compare the Ram ProMaster City, also known as the Fiat Doblo in other world markets, to the Metris. Again, in other world markets, that would be kind of a different comparison. The ProMaster City starts at $23,495 for the 2017 model year, so its price tag is not that far off the Metris. It is a little bit closer than the Transit Connect. In terms of overall size, the ProMaster City is also a little bit larger and a little bit more capable than the Transit Connect, so the delta between it and the Mercedes is a little bit closer. The Metris will give you 619 pounds more payload capacity, 3,000 pounds more towing capacity, and about 50 cubic feet more storage space. The last time we reviewed the ProMaster City, it struck me as odd that the cargo capacity is so close to being able to carry a 4x8 sheet of plywood, yet it still can't do it. And that is a pretty big omission for Fiat Chrysler, because of course the Pacifica and the Caravan can carry 4x8 sheets of plywood. And they used to have a commercial minivan known as the Ram CV, but that model has been replaced by the ProMaster City, which is a little bit smaller. In terms of overall fuel economy, the ProMaster City gets a slightly higher EPA rating, but in real-world driving, the two vehicles are very similar. In terms of overall pricing, the models are very close as long as you don't slot too many options over there on the Mercedes Metris. If you get carried away with the options list, the Metris can get quite expensive. You could also view the Metris as sort of the rugged alternative to a Chrysler Pacifica or an Odyssey or a Sienna or a Sedona. The Metris features that very square back end, a little bit more headroom, and of course a more rugged floor type than we find in your average passenger minivan. So if you planned on always having the third row out of the vehicle, using that for more utilitarian cargo space, and then carrying either 4 or 5 passengers around, the Metris may be an interesting alternative. I receive a large number of questions from viewers out there that are looking for something like a minivan to put bikes in the back of, but they don't like the fact that the modern American minivans have a little bit less space back there in the third row. The Metris is an interesting alternative here, because you will find more room in the back than you'll find in something like a ProMaster City, but the vehicle overall is just about as utilitarian as that ProMaster. On the flip side, you should know that the Metris is going to be more expensive and offer fewer standard features than pretty much any of the mainstream minivans in America that are more dedicated towards passenger carrying. Although you can remove the third row bench from the Metris and get a very large and very square cargo area back there, you should know that the seat modules themselves are less practical than the other minivans in the US, because the seats don't recline, they don't flip, they don't fold, and they don't fold into the floor. Obviously, the Mercedes Sprinter is the direct competitor to the Ford Transit, even in the United States, but you could logically compare the Mercedes Metris to the Transit as well, if you're simply looking for something that's more capable than a Transit Connect, but you don't need something quite as large as a Transit. In terms of overall price, the Metris is closer to the Transit Connect than the Transit. It's about $5,500 less than the larger Transit, but the payload capacity is right in between, offering about 1,000 pounds less than the Transit. When it comes to towing capability, they're very close, however. Only 400 pounds more towing capability in the Ford. The Metris gives you about 80 cubic feet more cargo capacity than the Transit Connect, but about 60 cubic feet less than the full-size cargo van. That's because the Metris was designed to be able to carry 4x8 sheet goods in the back, and so was the Ford Transit. In fact, the Ford Transit was designed to carry 4x10 sheets of things in the back, and that's why its cargo bed in the back between the wheel wells is about 4.5 feet by about 10.3 feet. Compared to the Transit, the Metris is going to be more nimble, more easy to park. It's also going to be an awful lot lighter on your wallet. It's less expensive to buy, and it's less expensive to operate in terms of fuel costs. Fuel economy is notably better in the Metris, and that will result in about an $850 per year fuel savings on the average driving cycle. As I said at the beginning, comparisons for the Metris are a little bit tricky. So in a category of one, it's pretty easy to pick the Metris as the best cargo-oriented minivan in America. If you're looking at the Metris as far as a passenger vehicle goes, there are a few use cases where you might want to get one over something like an Odyssey or a Pacifica, but for most family shoppers that are just looking for a minivan for their family, this is not necessarily going to be your best option. Of course, that makes sense, because that's not really what the Metris was intended for in the United States. If Mercedes had intended to compete directly with the Chrysler Pacifica, they would have brought the V-Class to America. Until then, if you're looking for one of the Goldilocks just right fits when it comes to cargo carrying, definitely take a look at the Mercedes Metris. It's definitely larger and more practical, which means it'll suit a number of different use cases better than a Transit Connect or a ProMaster City, but it's an awful lot easier to live with than full-size vans like the Transit or the ProMaster. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes. Be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos. And if you want to support this channel, you can head over to patreon.com and look us up there. I'll see you next week.